ustedes, Lawrence Waterman Ove.
Lo tenemos aquí, el aplauso para recibir al señor Lawrence Waterman, quien nos va a exponer sobre Construcción Segura, Buenas Prácticas Internacionales.
Oh, what an introduction. I apologize. I can say Buenas tardes, and that's about the limit of my Spanish. So you're stuck with an English presentation and a translation for those of you that don't follow it in my language. It's a great privilege and pleasure to be here. I'm very pleased to have been invited by the Chamber and by Mutual. When we started our work on London 2012, we made some decisions about what we were trying to do. And this afternoon is part of honoring those decisions that we made. And I will explain what I mean by that. Construction is the best sector for learning from its previous experience, from reviewing projects, looking at the way a company has developed, the way in which an individual task has been completed, and reviewing it, learning lessons, and making a difference so that in future construction is more efficient, has higher quality, and from the point of view of my focus, our focus this afternoon, is safer and healthier than it's ever been before. We are very good at doing that, and it's sharing those lessons with you today from my experience that I hope will add to the really stimulating conversations that I've had at company, Chamber of Construction and Mutual levels in the few days that I've been here. When we began on London 2012, we too were looking back at previous work. And like you, we had an industry with the support of government, the support of the trades unions and the major companies, determined to get better year by year. So we looked at the major projects in the UK, like the Channel Tunnel. We looked at, around the world, projects like the Boston Big Dig. What can we learn from that? And the most recent major project in London was the construction of a new terminal for our main airport at Heathrow. So when the president of the International Olympic Committee, Röger, tore the envelope open and said it's London and awarded the Olympic Games in 2012 to the organization led by Sebastian Coe, that fired a starting pistol that we were already moving, because we knew that if we were going to create a beautiful Olympic park that could cope with 250,000 visitors a day, an opening ceremony gave us a deadline of the 27th of July 2012, and we knew it was a big project. At the time that we started, we thought it was going to cost about $12 billion. That's US dollars, about 9 billion pounds. We thought that it would take 100 million working hours, and we found out that altogether 50,000 people were inducted in the program, and at peak 12,500 of them were working on the Olympic Park, the Athletes' Village, and the venues outside of London that contributed to the Games. But what we started with was a really horrible environment. Just like the Guggenheim in Bilbao, just like some of your construction programs here in Chile, the reason why the Olympics were chosen for East London by the UK government was because the area in which the venues were to be built and the park created was an area of high unemployment, high crime, high drug use. Children left school early. One of the measures that you can take is thinking about life expectancy. The people that lived in this area with this messy site with Europe's largest fridge mountain dumped on it, the people that lived in this area lived on average 9 years less than the people that lived around Westminster, just 10 miles away, where the decision of the government was taken to support the bid for the Olympics. So we knew that we were building for the 2012 Games in order to raise hope, expectation, and life for the people that lived in the area. And we decided that it was inappropriate for the benefits of the Olympics to only be felt after we finished our building work. We wanted those health benefits to be felt by the people who were going to be working on the program. And it was a complex program. We had to demolish over 200 buildings across a very large site that included high-rise buildings that were redundant and unoccupied. And across this large site, with all of this work, we had an environmental commitment that over 90% of the materials that we would be generating with the demolition and the site clearance and the decontamination of the ground would be reused on site. So that meant, from a safety and health point of view, that we were potentially exposing our workers not once to the material when they demolished the building, but a second time when they transported that material elsewhere on site, a third time when they stored it, ready for a fourth time when they cleaned it up. So health and occupational hygiene was very important from the beginning. And this large, complex site was surrounded by normal residences, by busy roads. We had to worry about the neighbors. Our program had to begin by driving shafts and tunneling under the site. A complex job, but we had to get rid of 52 electricity pylons, electricity towers, and the power lines that they carry. This was enabling work because at peak, 62 tower cranes were operating across this site. And as you know, power lines and tower cranes don't go very well together. And the first story I'd like to tell you, because this is a series of stories, is about this tunneling project. Because the tunneling was so important, enabling work that was a rate-limiting step on what we could do next on the site, that in one area of the site, we needed the land quicker than the tunneling project could deliver. So we paid £5 million, about $7 million, for a temporary diversion that enabled us to take down 2 of these towers. That gives you an idea of how this was a critical path project. But when, during the tunneling, the tunnelers suddenly hit a brick structure 30 meters below the ground, and a really horrible smell came into the tunnel. So the tunnel boring machine suddenly found that bricks were coming through the gate, and the workers in the tunnel started throwing up and passing out. We found out afterwards what the problem was, but initially engineers investigated and decided that we had hit a void that needed to be grouted to rejection in order to strengthen the ground and stop the tunnel collapsing. And that process took 2 weeks on this critical path project. At the same time, I had instructed hygienists to explore the problem, to take samples, and to come up with a protocol that would protect the workers, because we didn't know whether this contamination would be for the next half a kilometer of tunneling or whether it was just short term. And the hygienists and the engineers both had to sign off that they were satisfied that the tunneling could continue before it was permitted to. And the engineers signed off after 2 weeks. It took an extra few days before the hygienists had set up the training of the workers, the provision of appropriate respiratory protection, local ventilation, and health surveillance for the team. So this safety critical issue was addressed by our board as being more important than the program. And that sent a message to the whole of the management team that when you make a commitment on a project that you're not going to hurt people, you really need to deliver. I sometimes think when owners visit a construction site, it is useful if they lose their temper and say, this is terribly messy, stop all the work, spend the next hour clearing everything up. When you leave that site, the workers on that site will remember for months that you decided that stopping the work to make the site neat and tidy and safe was more important than keeping on with the production. But you've only lost a few minutes, and the people will catch up that work. But you have, in a way, you have demonstrated in a very practical way your leadership. We had an accidental opportunity to do that very early on in our program. Half of the 2 million tons of soil that we moved on the site had to go through these enormous washing machines in order to clean the contamination. We washed out the very fine particles weighing about 7% of the soil, but by doing so, we were washing out over 90% of the surface area of soil, over 90% of the contaminants. And while we were doing all this, 2/3 of our expenditure was on infrastructure. Because remember the regeneration. This wasn't just about building a stadium and an aquatic center. This was about creating a new development platform. Already 3,000 homes have been built on this site, and more are being built now. A school has been built and 2 more are underway. This is an area that will remain a park in its center, but along the edges is new accommodation, new job opportunities, new schools. There's an extension to a hospital going on, and this is going to lift the area out of the poverty that it was in before. We had other challenges on the program from a safety point of view. You know that in Athens, in Beijing, and more recently in Rio, certain venues were built that are not well used. You know, tumbleweed blew through Homebush, the Sydney Olympics site, for many years before it started being further developed and becoming a little more occupied. We were determined that there would be no white elephants in this area. So we hit a new record, 300,000 temporary seats. This was for basketball. 12,000 people could watch the basketball, but there was no legacy business case for a basketball venue in East London. So this was a temporary venue, subsequently removed to create a new building platform for some more homes in this particular area, and the extension to the university from central London, University College. And some of the venues that we were building were very challenging in design. This is the velodrome with its Pringle crisp-shaped roof. And complexity, if you want it, the aquatics venue is a permanent venue, but at games time it had seats for an extra 6,000 spectators that were removed after the games and replaced with this glass curtain walling. So all the time we were pushing the envelope of constructability whilst at the same time trying to achieve a good accident record. And we were managing venues outside of the Olympic Park. And while all this was going on, we were also building Europe's largest new housing estate, the Athletes' Village, which is now East Village in the area, with some 2,500 families and single people living in it. And some of the structures we were asked to build, you would not believe, as normal buildings. Now, what I want to talk about is our key focal points during this construction. around health and safety. So I'm going to say something about leadership, frontline supervisors, workforce engagement, the health story, which comes back to the superintendent's remarks about mental health, and something about reward and recognition. But I want to start by reminding you about where we have come from and where we are going in health and safety, not just in construction, but in all industries. You know that we began with trying to manage work procedures and giving individual work people very specific instructions for carrying out tasks. And then we introduced a system for managing that with risk assessments, method statements, and a lot of supervision, checking that people were working in the way that had been planned in advance. So we worked on the basis that we would tell people what to do and then check consistently that they were doing it. And we have driven down accident rates in our industry, in Chile, but around the world by adopting these approaches. It has worked, but it has hit a barrier. We have driven down the numbers of accidents, but we're now finding it hard to reduce them further. And there are two major problems that we have to address. People generally do not like being treated as if they are machines. So the idea that all we need to do is find the right switch, use the right training program. Even the word program makes you think of computers. We put in the tape, we put in the software, and magically the workers will behave consistently the same every time. And just to check, we will employ a lot of non-productive people to keep an eye on them and enforce it. It's not efficient, and we are discovering that there is a limit. It is effective to begin with, and when you're starting with a new team, and if you've only got them for a short time, it may be all that you can do. But in the longer term, and with people that you employ in your industry for a period, it is not sufficient to drive those accidents downwards even further. And what the new model says is do not scrap what you've been doing, but think about it and evolve it and develop it. So all of those checkers were concentrating on enforcement and identifying non-compliances, and people were being sanctioned. Think more about identifying, as the awards will do in a few minutes, think more about identifying the good practices and reward them. To embed the good practices is better than just punishing people. But more importantly, the way that you get away from policing is when the people who are working own and believe in the work methods that you wish them to employ, because it becomes their way of working. You need to do a lot less enforcement if most people already agree with the rules because they think it's their rules, not yours. And that's the direction of travel that we need to go in. And you're going to hear that on London 2012, we employed this approach very forcefully, because the contractors that we were bringing onto the program had already operated and were operating stage 1 and stage 2. They already had their policies, their procedures, their competent staff, their supervisors and their managers. They had the system of command and control. We wanted to convert it into a system of leadership and engagement. And we had the benefit, as I think you do, of working with regulators that really understood that. So although they had to maintain a distance from us, our health and safety executive, they still had to exercise their authority, and they knew that they could write letters that we had to respond to. They could issue improvement and prohibition notices, stopping the work, and of course, in extremis, they could prosecute if they decided that the work was being done unsafely and putting people at risk in a way that broke the law. But in the main, they operated as a critical friend. They were more concerned that we became an exemplar of good construction practice than simply exercising their regulatory muscle. So we invited them to present to our board, to attend meetings, that when they were carrying out inspections, that they would do it in partnership with our people and would discuss the findings. So they ended up challenging us, yes, but they supported us as well. And I think that that's a very good lesson. And it's an example of the way in which government and the industry can work very closely together, whilst at the same time maintaining appropriate roles for each. So on to leadership. When I was appointed, I was the 13th person to start working for the Olympic Delivery Authority as head of health and safety. I joined a few weeks after that handshake when the bid was awarded to London. And this was my estimate based upon the better projects in the UK at that time. The most recent major project completed, for example, if you remember I mentioned, was Terminal 5 at Heathrow, a very well-run project, but 2 people died. So I looked at the estimate of 100 million and did the calculations, and I went to the board and said, if we operate business as usual as a good project, we will kill 3 people. Now, these weren't construction professionals on the board. There were 1 or 2 that had experience of the industry, but it was essentially a non-executive board appointed by the government, and they were as interested in overseeing the money and the engagement with local communities as they were in construction activities. So I explained to them that it is a tradition in the UK construction industry that when you kill someone, and in our industry it's usually a man working on site, when you kill someone, the tradition is that a director, accompanied by the head of health and safety, visits the widow. So if you think this is what we ought to be doing, I need 3 of you to volunteer now that you will be the people that will come with me to visit the widows of the 3 people we're going to kill. And unsurprisingly, the board decided that, like your blue band, the only acceptable policy was 0. And they accepted responsibility. After all, when one of your businesses loses money on a project because the pricing was wrong, or you hit problems that you didn't anticipate because of ground conditions, or the client isn't happy because the building isn't ready on time, or you have structural problems with something that you've built, or you keep losing tenders and the banks are beginning to question whether there's a future to your business and whether they should still be extending the lines of finance, what do? I know, you call in the workers, don't you? Because it's obviously their fault. No, you, on the board and senior management teams, you take responsibility, don't you? And like the Chamber of Construction, that's what you need to do with health and safety. If there's a problem in safety, it's not because of the workers. Actually, as you will find out, they are the solution to the problems of safety, not the problem itself. So you take responsibility. That's what leadership means. So 3 deaths, unacceptable. This is what we actually achieved, and the reason why I am here speaking to you, why Christian and Mutual invited me, why the Chamber suggested that I come here in order to speak at this conference and engage with you and your colleagues this week. This is not a bad record for 85 million hours worked. And the way that we began, as I've mentioned, was with leadership. So we made a declaration, like your blue wristband. The declaration was, we wish to build for the Olympics without killing anyone. And what did our ministry say? I don't mean the ministry responsible for health and safety regulation. I mean the ministry responsible for paying the money to build for the Olympics. That ministry, the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, wrote back about our draft target of 0 fatalities and said you can't make that a public target because no one's ever achieved that before in an Olympic Games. People have always died constructing for the Olympics. And as we know, sadly, quite a lot of people have died in Beijing, in Rio, in Athens. But even the good games like Sydney still had fatalities. So you can't say 0. So our managing director, our chief executive, Sir David Higgins, wrote back and he copied the letter to all of the staff then working for the Olympic Delivery Authority, the ODA. This was in the spring of 2006. Just before the Olympic Act was passed, we were preparing to publish these documents because for the first time, we were going to make this as a public declaration. So he wrote back, but he copied us all in. There were about 100 staff at that point. He said, we're about to publish this document as the first document of the ODA after the Olympic Act becomes law. So he wrote back to the ministry and said, since you don't want us to have a target of 0, how many people do you want us to kill on the project? And of course, they immediately came back and said, you are allowed to publish your target of 0. So that's what we did. Now, that was the first time in the history of UK publicly funded construction that an organisation had published a set of commitments that it wanted to honour during the construction programme. It was a little booklet. And that booklet guided us to the way that we were going to procure contractors, designers, the materials we were going to use. It guided us on the way in which we would mobilize the contractors. Interesting process. I don't know if you do this. Probably in mining, probably in oil and gas. But we made it standard. The winning bidder had a few weeks before they started work. They came to meet with us. And we said, you've won the bid, congratulations. This is the standard that we gave you at the time that you were bidding, that we want you to work to. In 2 weeks' time, before we allow you to start work, we want you to come back and explain in detail how you're going to manage your work so that no one is killed. No one has his health damaged. There's good communication. You've got competent, trained people. We saw all the paperwork. Now we want to hear it from your management team that's actually going to run the project on the site. We want to have a conversation where you make promises to us in person, not just with paperwork from estimators and senior people that want the job. This was the vision on the first page of our standard. And you'll notice that it's not about just preventing harm. That's half the story. Remember why we were building for the Olympics. We wanted to raise the well-being of the people in the area. Why shouldn't that start with the construction workers? We wanted them to be healthier and safer than if they stayed at home in bed. We wanted them to be better off being active, working with us. And leadership, as you know, I mean, the chamber knows this. We've heard it from the introductions to this afternoon. Leadership is the key to the performance you want. The body follows the head. But it's no good having leadership that just is based on speeches being made. It's got to be very practical. It needs to have a structure. So you need to ask some hard questions. One of them, and an obvious one, is how many workers know who you are? would recognize you if they happened to have won the lottery and walk into the restaurant that you're in on Saturday evening with your partner? How many of them know you personally? And how many of them do you know? Very, very few. So when we talk about leadership in our industry, we can talk about the strategy that you set out. We can talk about the things that you say and do when you are visible to your teams. But we ought to be honest about the limited visibility that naturally senior people like us actually have with our workers every day. It is limited, not because we're nasty people and we're frightened of our workers and we don't want to make contact with them, but you all employ or direct through your supply chains hundreds and thousands of people. There is a logistic limit to the number of names that you can remember. So the leadership really matters, those declarations, the way that you shape things. This was the mission statement of the leadership team that we established across the whole program. Every project director, and some of them were responsible for $600 million projects, every project director on site, not a deputy, not a junior, it had to be the director, unless they were sick or on holiday. It was as if we had to get a letter from their mother before we accepted that they couldn't attend the meeting. Once a month, for 1 hour, they all came to a meeting. And this is what they came up with in the first 3 months of the program when the leadership team started meeting. This was their mission, their vision. They wanted to be able to say the safest, no deaths, the healthiest, no ill health, the greenest, really good environmental program. Simple language, not complex, not to do with graphs and numbers. And they worked with a charter that defined how they would behave with each other. If someone came to a meeting and said, in the next month I'm going to do this, when they came to the next meeting, their peers around them running the other projects would say, have you done it? And if they hadn't, they were in breach of the commitment they'd made to do with their personal behavior as leaders. So this was personal as well as corporately strategic. It defined how they were going to work. And each project had the same approach. And they took many initiatives. Daily activity briefings became an obligation, not from the client, but from the leadership team, where the client had one seat at the table in exactly the way that each project director did. So I sat in all of those meetings, and some of the meetings my chief executive or my construction director would attend, but there was one seat at the table for the client, one seat for every other project director. And these are the things that they decided were the rules for the site. So they said, if you are a leader and you have a high potential learning event in your project, a major near miss that could have been very serious, you will lead the investigation exactly as you would if it was a fatality. No different. When you drive the accident rate down, you have to treat the nearlies as seriously as you treat the real accidents. You don't go on holiday instead. So they made real decisions. And the biggest decision they made, in my opinion, was based on this recognition that for ordinary workers, starting work every day on a construction site, the person that they saw as their leader was not us, it was their supervisor. In our case, black hats, in Chile, white hats. So we decided that the training for supervisors, mandatory training, would be on leadership. We did not, as a client and as a leadership team, say to the owners, you are appointing people who are not technically competent. We're going to train them in how to manage excavations, in how to manage access equipment and working at height. That would have been disrespectful and stupid. We said, you have appointed supervisors because you have confidence in their technical ability, and you have systems of assessment, of training, of promotion of your supervisors, and your managers monitor their performance. We accept all of that. But we have made it a requirement that your supervisors give a daily activity briefing at the beginning of every shift to their team. Have you ever trained them in how to speak to a group? Have you trained your young supervisors in how to go up to an older worker and challenge behavior when that older worker says, but I've been doing it like this since before you were born, go away? Being a supervisor is not easy, and we tend to promote people because they are good technically, and then we hope that they will develop the interpersonal skills that enable them to be really powerful, effective supervisors. We said trusting to luck wasn't good enough, so we trained them. But we did more than that. We booked venues like this, possibly not quite as glitzy as this, but we booked venues every 3 months in or near the Olympic Park, and we brought all the supervisors from all the projects. Now, we didn't do it all on the same day. We divided it into 3 groups so work could continue. And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, all the supervisors for that afternoon would be gathered from different projects. And for an hour, they were given briefings. To begin with, they were from managers and health and safety advisors. By the end of the program, the briefings were from fellow supervisors, and they really listen when it's from their peers. So what happened was when, for example, the electricity was going to go live on a particular project, the electrician supervisors would give the briefing about the risks and hazards to do with live electrics. An hour of those briefings, and then you're free to go now. It's the end of your work. But at this point, beer, wine, soft drinks, and some food was served. And managers and owners from different contractors would come in and join, and there would be a period of networking, of discussing things. We were treating them the way that you treat your management teams when you try and bond them and get them to work effectively together. I mean, commonly we take management teams and we have away days and we book them into hotels. God, in construction, we play golf at a moment's notice with senior colleagues. We thought if we want our supervisors to behave as leaders, we had to treat them as leaders. We had to show them the respect. When you use the word leader, you've got to mean the word. You've got to think of all its implications and behave towards them in the way that you would expect any of your fellow directors and owners to be treated by their colleagues. Now, the result of this is after the training course. Take their picture. Every few weeks, enough people have gone through the training that you can make this a poster and put it at the entrance to all of the project sites. A wall of fame, we called it. And a small version of this poster, in a frame with a sheet of glass, was given to every supervisor in the picture, which they took home to their families. They were given special badges to wear. And it's like those statues around Santiago. If you put your supervisors on pedestals, if you make them feel, not artificially but genuinely important and responsible, it's like making someone the captain of a football team. They try harder. They feel more of an obligation to the company and to the team that they're leading. In other words, by treating them as if they were already behaving brilliantly, we made it harder for them to do anything other than behave brilliantly. And I prepared this presentation before coming to Chile because I'm telling the story of my experience of London 2012. And I met with one of Christian's team, Carla, talking about supervisor development and training. This is a video from a training course that's been piloted now in a number of companies and over 30 sites with 1,500 workers. This is a supervisor giving a morning briefing to a group of people. And you can see that he's looking around and making eye contact. One of the things you do in these training courses is you video people when they are giving a talk to their colleagues, to their team. And you know, the shy supervisor's not used to it. They're staring at the ground, they're mumbling, they're looking at a bit of paper. When you teach them how to do it properly, they make eye contact. They're vigorous. They give some energy to it. They really communicate with their team. And most importantly of all, they say, are there any questions? Are there any comments? The daily activity briefing is the biggest boost to your team's productivity that you could ask for. Because once it's working well, the guys in the team that know that piece of equipment isn't working properly, these materials are running out, and if we don't get a delivery tomorrow, the job's going to grind to a halt. They become extensions of your supervisor. They start operating like a team. How can we work effectively? If you get this right, you end up with 10 to 20% boost in productivity from the people working, even though the reason why you're doing it is the few minutes every morning opportunity to talk about health and safety. Now, I just want to say something about health and safety people. Driven by management teams, every accident is investigated to the nth degree, even if someone's just tripped up over their own feet. And the result is the procedures are amended. Even worse, a new procedure is written. You know, when you're walking across the white line, you use procedure A to not trip up. But when you're walking over a grey line, it's a different procedure. So you end up with a whole book of words communicating to the workforce something very simple. What you're telling the workers is if it goes wrong and there's an accident, it's their fault because they didn't follow the procedures properly. But the procedures are like a legal code. Only an expert could possibly remember most of it. And even then, we have libraries to go to, don't we? So what we did instead was we tried to communicate much more with pictures. We told people this is what good looks like and this is what bad looks like. And if we couldn't do it just in pictures, we had some very simple standards. Standards that said, and this is not meant to be read, but standards that said, this is the issue, this is the minimum that you ought to be doing, and looking around the Olympic program, this is best practice. And when inspectors are going to visit from the health and safety team, they used this guidance and these pictures. So the rules that were given to the supervisors were exactly the same as the inspectors were using to do the checks. No surprises, no complex interpretation of the rules, as simple and straightforward as possible. And all of our communication was designed to be of a quality that you would expect if you were trying to sell ice cream or chocolate bars. Simple communications, but nicely presented. And this one says, help watch my back, report all near misses. That was my only KPI. On the whole program, my KPI was how many near miss reports could we get, because the more that people told us about things that weren't right, the more that we could take corrective action and put it right. It's also a measure of culture, a willingness of construction workers to talk up rather than shut up and get on with their work, which is what they've been trained to do by the way in which managements have treated them in the past. And workforce engagement, you can tell the seventh of the 7 golden threads, the golden rules from ISA. So I've talked about leadership. I'm now going to the brackets, leadership and workforce engagement. Whatever you do in the middle, you can do what you like. You can talk about quality. You can talk about productivity. You can talk about customer service if you're running a venue or a hotel. But if you've got leadership and workforce engagement, you can manage it. You can manage anything in between. Any targets you want to set, with the right leadership and your workforce engaged, you can do it. So from induction through those daily activity briefings and to encourage engagement with the workforce, we made arrangements that if they said something needed action, it would be investigated and they'd get feedback. The toilets are dirty in the afternoon because they're only ever cleaned at the beginning of the day. You said toilets are dirty in the afternoon. We've asked the cleaners to come back at lunchtime and re-clean. Very simple, but the more that management gives that feedback, the more the workers speak up because they can see action is being taken. And towards the end of our program, we thought we were going to have to use athletes to come and visit and shake hands. Here's Mo Farah, come and shake his hand. We thought the workers would be really proud that they were building Olympics venues. Actually, it wasn't true. We did some market research amongst our workforce, and what we found was that the thing they were proudest of was their own work. Be proud became a standard theme in everything that we communicated. You know, that opening video to this afternoon's session with the way in which the country is built by construction, maintained by construction. How many times do you go on holiday and stay in a really nice hotel, go and visit some buildings from a period hundreds of years ago, drive there or fly there to airports or drive there on roads? What can we do apart from go back to living in caves that isn't touched by our great industry? It isn't difficult to communicate in the way that that video did earlier on what a wonderful privilege it is to work in construction, shaping the world that we live in and providing all the facilities to people. How often do we try to really convey that sense of pride to our workforce? Because the prouder they feel about their work, the more careful they will be to do it well. And that means productivity and quality as well as health and safety. So instead of using athletes in our last communication program, don't rush to the finish, be careful, hold on to the safety record, we used construction workers in PPE, and this is someone cycling around the velodrome. And what you can't see in the poster and can't hear is that there were 1,000 workers working on the velodrome cheering that one of their team had won the ballot for being the first cyclist on the velodrome. Workers can be encouraged to feel very proud of their health and safety record. And if you manage to do that, instead of relying on policing, you've got the whole team looking after your record. And I'm coming towards an end. I don't want to outstay my welcome. I hope this is all right. I just wanted to say something about health in the way that the superintendent was mentioning about mental health. In general, we were fairly clear that what we wanted were healthy workers, healthy workplaces, and we wanted the workers' well-being. We wanted them to make lifestyle choices, healthy choices, so that they would be fit and productive for us, but also fit and productive for the lives that they wanted to lead. Now, unlike you, we did not have a fantastic hospital arrangement, which I was privileged to visit yesterday, with a world-class burns unit, for example. We didn't have that. We had to do things ourselves for the site and then rely on the National Health Service for the acute care when it was needed. But what we did do was run a program where we invested in the health of the workforce, and the research that was carried out demonstrated that that was an investment, not a cost. It actually saved us money in productive time of the workers on site. Instead of them having to go off for medical treatment, we made arrangements so they got medical treatment, the minor incident treatment on the site. Very effective. So we looked after the worker. We made healthy workplaces with an occupational hygiene intervention, but we ran well-being. So my last anecdote, we had a report from the nurses that people were fainting on site in the middle of the morning. I got a report from my safety team that we had a spike of minor accidents in the middle of the morning, about 11 o'clock. So we did a survey of the workers on their way out. On their way into the workplace, they just wanted to clock in and get on with their work and earn their money. On the way out, put some attractive nurses on a gate to ask questions, and you'll be surprised how willing the workers are to stop and talk to them. The survey was asking about breakfast, and we found that over 80% of our workers did not have breakfast. They came into work and started working sometimes physically quite hard, and their blood sugar was getting lower and lower. Then they would have a big lunch, work through the afternoon, on their way back to typically digs, because, bed and breakfast or whatever, because they weren't, accommodation around big sites. They were just living where they could, sharing rooms, all of that. No cooking facilities. They would just buy a takeaway on their way home. And the takeaways are not as nice as your empanadas. They were not very good food. Things like Kentucky Fried Chicken, which we don't really want to talk about. So we had workers who had low blood sugar mid-morning, hence the fainting, but also low blood sugar affects your concentration, and that probably explained the minor accidents. But the other thing about feast and famine, where the blood sugar soars when you have a big meal and then goes into a trough because you've not eaten for hours, if you keep doing it, you unbalance your body's ability to manage sugar in the blood. So you end up with a tendency towards obesity, and you begin to develop a greater chance of having type 2 diabetes. So you've got long-term health, immediate safety issue, and the concentration would affect production and quality as well as accidents. So this is a picture, this chap here is in a sitcom from the UK called Porridge, which is slang for doing time in prison. And lots of our workers had seen the sitcom. So we got permission from the BBC to use the image, and we ran a program where in the winter, workers got very cheap, 50 cents, a tub of porridge with maple syrup or fruit or raisins on top. We went from 80% of the workers not having breakfast to 80% having breakfast. It didn't cost anyone anything because more workers went to the canteens that had to be open under their contract, but not many people were buying food there. So it ended up being good for the people running the canteens. It didn't cost anything, and the outcome was our accident rate went down and the workers were healthier. I think the program around health and well-being needs to be raised to a different level so that it is as professionally dealt with as we're now dealing with accident prevention. But the great thing about well-being is that every worker understands their own health. It's the one thing they depend on to be able to work and earn money for their families. So you've got a common interest. The workers are genuinely interested in their own health. You will end up using health as a mode of reaching out and engaging with your workers, and you'll find, amazingly, that it reduces your accident rate as well, because the workers become more engaged in the idea of looking after themselves. And then, final point, reward and recognition. You read behavioral safety texts, and they tell you 4 elements of positive reinforcement for every negative sanction-based criticism. And then we send out inspectors to look for non-compliances. It's stupid. So we made a rule. We had people doing inspections. You're carrying out an inspection report. Every time you make a criticism, you've got to find 4 things that are good. So the usual is there are 20 people there, and the one at the far end is not wearing his hearing defenders. So you walk past the 19 people that are, completely ignoring them, and go and shout at the person that's not wearing his hearing defenders and tell him he's breaking the rules. We said no. What you do is you go to every one of the 19 and thank them for wearing the right PPE. You then go and send them for a free breakfast, and you turn to the 20th and say, terribly sorry, no breakfast for you because you weren't following the rules. And then next month, you change it. And now you say to the 20, if all of you are wearing the right PPE, you get a free breakfast. Now you don't need a supervisor to tell anyone anything, because the individual workers are saying, oi, put on your hearing protection or I won't get my free breakfast. You need to think about the kind of team building that we're used to doing at a higher level and do it with your supervisors and your workers. The same principles, but just drive them down. That's what leadership is about, is cascading down to the lowest level that will make a difference. And of course, whenever you're on site, you wear the hearing protection, the right PPE, you engage people, you thank them for their work. And I think that quote from Sandhurst is really helpful, that the best you can expect from your team is the worst they see you do. They're not going to be better than you. Honestly, our reward and recognition was based on badges that cost pennies. People loved getting the badges. And we had special ones with black hats for the supervisors that they got when they completed the training course. This was the first time we worked 1 million hours without a lost time. All the workers gathered together, and in the front there, that's David Higgins and Sebastian Coe, the ODA's chief executive, and Lord Coe, who was running the organisation that put on the Olympics once we'd built the venue. After this picture was taken, they all went into the canteen for breakfast. David and Seb worked the room, walking around, talking to people, finding out what it was like working here, thanking them. By the time they came out, a cropped version of this picture in a frame was available for every worker to take home as a thank you. Simple, and it didn't cost very much. And you know, if we can turn health and safety from compliance monitoring to saying thank you, the safety advisors will love it as well, because it's much nicer to be able to say to people you're doing a great job than continually being the people that kick the workers and the supervisors for not doing it properly. This is what we achieved. A spike of a few minor accidents early on, and then, as you know, and you've experienced it, a long-term low accident rate. And this is what the head of our military, the Chief of Staff, the head of the Army said when he visited the Olympic Park, that health and safety was the bedrock of production, on time and on budget. That meeting I told you about of the leadership team was the only time all of the project directors came together. There weren't other meetings where they all came together, because health and safety was the only issue that everyone shared and took responsibility for collectively. Everything else was to do with the individual projects. You know, the money, the production targets, the issues to do with what you were building and when you were building it. That was individual per project, as you would expect. But because we made health and safety the umbrella, it pulled everyone together. And our general recognized that when he visited. There was some research done, individual elements of research into the health program, into leadership, all sorts of things. When that was all done, a research team at Loughborough University, where I'm now a professor, was asked this question: what was it at the beginning that the Olympic Delivery Authority did that made it more likely that from a health and safety point of view it would be a successful program? You can delete health and safety, can't you? If you've got an organization that shows respect to the supply chain, that trusts the workers, that is clear about what it wants, that tries to identify problems in advance to tackle them, that challenges bad behavior or assumptions, that is consistent in its requirements, that works collaboratively, I don't have to read the rest of it out, isn't that going to be an organization that makes loads of money, that's profitable, produces high quality goods, that provides excellent service, good food if it's a restaurant? I mean, these are elements of the DNA of a high-performing organization. If you get health and safety right, it will mean that you will have a more efficient business that makes more money, that is liked by your clients, that gets recurrent work. Absolutely convinced of it. So we had a regulator that was our critical friend. We really focused on leadership, and in particular the frontline supervisors, and through them we engaged the workforce in every opportunity. We addressed health rather than just accident prevention with a real element of well-being as well as the industrial hygiene preventative side. And we tried to celebrate success rather than simply identify and sanction failure. And since then, it's influenced the conversion of the Olympic Park into the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. This approach with the published standard, the leadership, the workforce engagement, the largest rail project currently going on in the UK, HS2 is not underway yet, a new rail line across London, mainly underneath, a big new expansion to the old Victorian sewer system, Tideway. And all of these projects, go onto their websites and look at the health and safety program, and you will recognize that it's developed and advanced, but there's a kind of set of themes that began with London 2012. I was Director of Health and Safety for 3 years at Battersea, and I had the privilege of helping the New Zealanders launch their safety charter for the rebuild following the earthquakes. The same kind of approach, leadership and workforce engagement as the brackets around it. But our industry doesn't stand still. And back to the comments of the superintendent, which we were discussing mental ill health at lunchtime. There's a growing awareness of this issue, but at the time that we were building for the London Olympics, we were still blind to how big an issue it was. So we had a health program, but it didn't adequately address mental health. So last year, the British Safety Council, working with some other charities, mental health charities, the Samaritans, which mainly deals with discouraging suicide, Mind, which is looking at mental ill health in all sorts of contexts, including the workplace, and Mental Health First Aid England, which deals with developing first aiders that can deal with mental health issues in the way that we have first aiders who deal with physical health issues. We launched this new program, Mates in Mind, for construction, and I'm hoping through Mutual to be able to share some of these materials so that, as the superintendent has argued, as there is going to be an increasing focus on mental health, we can have a global approach to something that in a way is becoming a new blight. We thought as we got better at managing the physical environment of the workplace that people would naturally be healthier, but the mental stresses and pressures of modern life are huge, not just at work, but the workplace is a wonderful venue for addressing groups of people and providing support. And Mates in Mind is certainly a very important project for doing that. And so finally, the ISSA 7 Golden Rules, I focused on 2 of them this afternoon, but I hope that what I've been saying is consistent with the direction of travel of the Chilean construction industry. I feel that it is. Showing leadership and investing in your people are probably the key themes of my presentation. So health does matter and well-being can drive improvements. Engaging the workforce is the key. But like with mental health being added onto our agenda, we've got to be brave and be flexible. The world of work keeps changing. The gig economy, the use of autonomous machines, all sorts of things will change in the future. Health and safety has got to move with that. Thank you very much for your attention.